So how many of you have heard of IPM? So about half. So integrated pest management. It's really a holistic way of looking at pest management. So that way we're not using a single strategy to control an insect, because oftentimes an insect then finds other ways to survive. Maybe you've used the same insecticide over and over again, and then you're realizing that, hey, this one isn't working anymore. So this is a way to approach this really in different facets and try and really suppress these pests more holistically. So the first way that we do this is really with prevention. So making sure that we have clean seed, clean plant stock, that would be one way to prevent the problems in the first place. So you may go to a box store, purchase a plant, and it has aphids on it, and you bring it home. And now you've introduced an insect that maybe you didn't have an issue with before. And so in order to prevent that, well, making sure you're not bringing it home in the first place, right? The other way that we can prevent issues is with proper fertilization, irrigation. If you keep plants healthy, then you may not end up with some of these other issues that we'll talk about. But that's a way to prevent insect problems. Identification, as we talked about, some insects can be pests, some can be beneficial. So what are we dealing with? Monitoring. For some insects we can monitor, and even on our Utah Pest website, for insects like the codling moth, where we provide advisories of when these moths start to make their way in. These are the moths that are going to lay eggs, and their larvae are going to feed on apples or pears. And so we have ways of kind of helping to survey and start to look out for these insects early on. Action thresholds, so manage when needed. Just because we have a single insect that we know is a pest, but it's not at high levels, doesn't mean we have to nuke the whole place. You know, really, we want to, we might just have to squish that one and the job's done, you know. So you can leave a couple of fruit for maybe a couple of insects, and then you have an abundance of others. But the idea here is just to start to monitor these populations. If they start to get out of hand, like with aphids, maybe you're just spraying them down with water and that's enough. There's several strategies that we can use to suppress insects. Biological control, that would be, as an example, using insects to control insects, using insect diseases against them. There's also cultural control. So this might be planting earlier than you're used to planting. That way you're throwing off the cycle of the insect and the plant. So that plant might be ahead of any insects coming into the area. Chemical control. So insecticides, I mean, many of you maybe have used a lot of insecticides already. Mechanical control. So this would just be taking off your shoe and start smashing them. Okay? If it, you know, it's not always practical. Start doing a dance. But mechanical, I mean, there's a lot of different ways. Even in turf grass, for example, just aeration of the soil. So as you're pulling those plugs out of the turf, you can kill certain stages in the soil. When you're tilling soil, you might kill pupal stages that are in the soil. So these would be mechanical methods. They may not be your intent to initially kill the insect, but it's actually a way that you might help to suppress some of those populations. Do you have a specific question? So with that one, an example would be as if you planted earlier or maybe later than you normally would, because then you're throwing off the timing of when the insect is kind of moving into the area versus the plant being grown. Maybe it's not there, and so then the insect's life cycle is sort of ending. Or the plant has already grown to a level where even when the insects come, the plant can overcome any feeding that occurs. With chemical applications, of course, read the labels, follow the recommended rates, time the applications for success. Timing is a big component of applying these insecticides. You know, if you find an insect or an adult insect, it may not be the right time to actually spray. It might be a pest, but the larvae might be the ones doing the damage. And so you go out there, you spray, and we call it a recreational spray, you know, because you're just kind of doing it for fun, and you've wasted your money because the damage has already been done. In other times we've seen where damage has been done by an insect, but the insect isn't there anymore. And you still apply something expecting that you're going to get improvement, and that would also be a recreational spray. You know, the insect's not there, so the chemical's not doing anything. Okay? So timing is really important. And then, if possible, utilizing chemical rotations. And what this means is, many of you have probably heard of stories with antibiotics and how bacteria become resistant to a lot of antibiotics. Well, insects become resistant to insecticides too. And so if you apply something over and over again, maybe you're used to using Carbaryl or 7 all the time, and you've used it for years. And this year it happens to be that, you know, I always kill these things, but this year 50% of those things survived. And you keep on applying Carbaryl, and it's just not working for you anymore. It could be that you've selected for a population where they're resistant to it. And so every year as they reproduce, the genes that are associated with resistance are carried on to their offspring. And so then eventually none of those insects in that population will be affected by that product. And so it's switching up the different types of insecticide, what are called modes of action, how it kills the insect. It can actually reduce resistance issues. So what does a healthy plant look like? You know, so is this healthy here?
What kind of plant is it?
I don't know. What kind of plant is it? This one actually turns out to be an ornamental that's supposed to look spotty like that. You know, the leaves they kind of look spotty there. It's supposed to look that way. So really, my point is just, what's the standard for this plant, and what is it supposed to look like, and then go from there. Because sometimes you might see something and go, well, this just doesn't look right. But is that really true? So when we look at plants and looking at disorders of plants, it turns out that most of what we find is due to abiotic factors, so the environment, improper irrigation and fertilization. So if we don't water properly, if we don't fertilize properly, then what happens is we see insects and diseases occur secondarily. It's not oftentimes where we see insects being the primary cause of the damage. So it's these abiotic things that we have to look out for, and I'll show you examples of what I'm talking about here. So first, sometimes we see herbicide damage that can look like insect damage. So maybe some residue on soil where then we have a corn plant and then we have kind of this burn. There's some insects that can cause damage that might look a little bit like that. You know, some drift issues here. Mowing damage. So sometimes you might see the top of a canopy of a tree where one whole branch, all the leaves are drying up. And maybe there are insects on that dying branch. But is the problem due to insects? Well, if you look below and you're seeing that this tree's been weed whacked and hit by a lawnmower, this can be your actual issue of why the plant is more susceptible to insects. And so looking out for these other indirect things going on. Nutrients, these are just examples of corn leaves with different nutrient symptoms, but nutrients are really important. If you over-fertilize, if there's a high nitrogen content, more than a recommended rate, the plant might stick out like a sore thumb and insects will be really attracted to that particular plant. Sunburn can look a lot like insect damage as well, or even disease. And then what we call, excuse my language, but it's scientific term, it's canine pisciitis. Have you heard of this? So it's browning of that turf. Okay, and so turf just generally turns brown. Sometimes there's patterns, sometimes there's not when it comes to damage to turf. But the idea is it due to insects, and how can we manage it? Let's go back to the mouth parts. So with the mouth parts, we have chewing mouth parts, right? So we know that that's either going to be leaves cut out, stems notched off. We know that it can be a larva that burrows into fruit, as with this codling moth. Here's roots that would be notched off by white grubs. We have this insect that's burrowed into a cherry, right? Maybe a larva of a fruit fly or something. But the main thing is a couple of things to look for. One is the chewing damage itself. But what are the signs that, let's say the insect's gone. So what are other ways that we can look to see whether or not it's due to insects? Well, insects do have to excrete what they eat. And so entomologists call that frass. So insect poop is called frass. It looks a lot like sawdust sometimes. So here with this wood borer that's been feeding on bark, it's left out like this sawdust-looking frass. We see that with turf insects as well. As they're chewing on roots, when they excrete, they have this sawdust-looking frass. Even with codling moths, if you looked at where the entrance hole was, there'll be some frass there. Here, there's a little piece of frass. And so be on the lookout for those signs that there may be damage. The insect may have already left, but was it due to an insect? What are some of those signs? You can even look for webbing for some insects as well. They'll leave webbing around. But the damage here is going to look a lot different than piercing sucking insects. So as we mentioned, they have the stylet. We'll see leaves that are curled, kind of gnarled here. I talked about the stink bug and its piercing sucking mouth parts. Look at how the even kind of dimples there as it's piercing through the flesh. So that's pretty characteristic for a piercing sucking insect. And then the borers, they're cryptic, going to be under that bark, but their mouth parts chewing, they're going to be leaving that frass behind that looks like sawdust. There's a lot of gall formers as well. You may not actually see the insects because they're actually tucked inside of a gall. So once they make it into the plant, and there's a handful of insects that do this. Yes?
What is a gall?
So there's some insects that will actually lay an egg inside of a plant, and the plant's response is to basically envelop that insect, but the insect actually encourages it. It wants it to happen, and that way they can actually live in a little chamber inside of that gall. A lot of times we see this with oaks and roses. Those are probably two of the plants that we often see galls with. Hackberry. Yeah. Yep. So there's like tiny wasps that can do this. There's aphids can cause galling. Midges. Yeah, there's a lot of different insects that could cause galling. But if you look at this leaf, like this, here would be an example of those galls. So if you cut those open, you could find the insects in there. All right, so let's diagnose some problems. So we got issues. So what kind of insect would cause that kind of issue? So what kind of mouth parts? Chewing mouth parts, got no leaves, stems are all chopped up. What kind of plant was that? Probably couldn't tell because there was no leaves or anything, but tomato, I was hearing, it was potato actually, so same family of plants. Solanaceous plant. Let's say we find this critter there. Looks like that one's actively feeding, so I'd consider it probably, maybe it's pest, right? It's probably causing that damage. What stage is this insect in? Larva. Why do you think larva? Because they what? They eat a lot. It's kind of soft looking. Yep. So they don't have like the wings, the hardened, really hardened exoskeleton like you see with the adults. So yep, this is the larval stage, and it is an insect. 1, 2, 3 legs, so 6 legs total. Let's say this insect wasn't even there, but we saw the chewing. Like, how would we know it was still due to the insect? Frass. Yep. So one, you would see the actual holes, but it would leave this frass behind, right? So we would know that at least the damage is still due to an insect. So the nice thing about knowing the stage is that at least the larvae tend to be more susceptible to a lot of treatment. So this would be a good time probably to manage this particular insect, right? So does the injury match the insect? Well, when we look at its mouth parts, it actually does have chewing mouth parts. We actively saw it feeding on the leaves, and so in this case, injury matches the insect. It's a pest. We know we need to do something about this one. Anybody know what this insect is? Potato beetle, Colorado potato beetle. Not very common in Utah, more in the bigger potato growing areas in the Pacific Northwest, really damaging in the east. Important pest of solanaceous crops. All right, is there injury? So the leaves are supposed to be green, and they kind of are, but there's some other stuff going on. They're coated with something. Let's say we see a bunch of these things. Ants. So ants here. So insects are present. So ants. What kind of mouth parts do ants have? chewing mouth parts. What kind of damage would you expect with an ant? Holes. Would they cause this kind of damage then? Probably not, but I did hear aphids, right? Other insects that produce honeydew, I like to talk about this because some ants like to tend things that produce honeydew. And aphids are one of those. So if you've ever parked your car underneath a tree that had aphids on it, of course you got honeydew that's sticky and it's on your car now. It's hard to get off, right, off the car. When you look at this, they actually herd aphids around like cattle almost. They are feeding on the honeydew specifically. So here's this sugary substance, ants of the rear end of the aphid, and ants keeping that aphid alive. So what happens here is that aphid honeydew, and actually honeydew of any other insect, is very sugary. It's a good medium for sooty mold. And so when you see sooty mold, it's probably due to aphids. Now the thing with ants is that they keep aphids alive. If you wanted to throw on some lady beetles, not that I would encourage you to buy lady beetles anyways, but if you just decided, I got to throw lady beetles on here, the ants will actually defend the aphids and will shoo away the lady beetles. They'll attack those other predators because they want the aphids alive. And so from a management standpoint here, we would have to, if we're going to use something like biocontrol, if we want to use lady beetles or some other insect that attacks aphids, we need to do something about the ants. And here you might do a tanglefoot, some type of sticky trap that's actually at the base of a tree. Sometimes if you see trees where the very tops of the canopies are covered in aphids and you see ants running up and down the trunks, you'll want to do something about the ants first before you do something with the aphids if it concerns biocontrol. Okay. But the idea here is you might see a lot of insects. You might see ants only. You may not even see the aphids because they're way up high. But the thing is that the ants themselves are doing something else, and look at these interactions that could be occurring. All right, this will be the last one before we take a small break. Got some turf here, really yellow in color. Got these translucent looking things in here. Say I pull all those little guys out and I find these noodles. I don't know. We got a fly maggot over here. Anybody know what these are? They're actually a really tiny insect, but so nematode I kind of heard. They're actually bigger than a nematode. So what's going on with the soil here? What's really wet? So how many of you have watered your houseplants too much sometimes? Yeah. So what happens after you water your houseplants too much? They rot. But what else? What insect related? What happens? Fungus gnats. So fungus gnats. So those are fungus gnat larvae. Okay. So this person wanted me to recommend them what kind of product to kill all these insects. And they had a lot of fungus gnat larvae there. And they probably could have recommended an insecticide. It would have killed everything in there. But the turf would have never improved. But why? Too wet. So what did I recommend then? Changing watering, water heavy, less frequently. The idea here is that just because there's insects there doesn't mean that they're causing damage. Okay, so fungus gnats are not a turf pest, but they were in high numbers in this case. And going back to the abiotic factors and how they affect insect populations, this is one of those examples where you might get these insects coming to you, but the idea is, do these insects cause that kind of damage? Would I expect them to do that to this turf? And so tying those links together, okay? So I have some books up here, a couple that if you wanted to look at, one from Whitney Cranshaw, he's at Colorado State University. It's a pretty good gardening book. A couple of other ones out of California, Pests of the Garden and Small Farm. And then there's another one, The Natural Enemies Handbook, that talks about all the good bugs. Some that are resident already, you'll find them, and others that they'll actually, you can purchase them if you maybe have a greenhouse or high tunnel where you're trying to do something within that and have pests in there.